When my son Daniel told me he was getting married, he looked me in the eyes and smiled in that same gentle way he had when he was a child. "Mom," he said quietly, "nothing will change." I remember the moment clearly. The late afternoon sunlight was coming through the kitchen window and falling across the wooden table where Daniel had eaten his meals since he was a little boy. I was stirring a pot of soup on the stove, the same recipe I had made for him countless times over the years. When he said those words, I smiled and nodded, because I wanted to believe him. After all, Daniel had always been a good son. He called me often, he never forgot my birthday. Even when he was busy with work, he would stop by just to sit for a few minutes and drink tea with me. So when he told me nothing would change, my heart felt calm. But now, looking back, I realize something about life. Sometimes people say things with love in their hearts, and they truly mean those words. But life has a quiet way of moving forward anyway. And sometimes the changes come so slowly that you do not notice them until everything is already different. For most of my life, it had just been the two of us, Daniel and me. His father passed away when Daniel was only 8 years old. One cold winter morning, he left for work like he always did, but that evening, a police officer knocked on our door. After that, day after day, the house felt much larger and much quieter. Daniel was too young to understand everything, but he understood that something was missing. For a while, he would ask questions that were hard for me to answer. "Mom, when is Dad coming back?" he asked one night while sitting at the kitchen table with his homework. I remember sitting beside him and gently touching his hair before saying, "He isn't coming back, Daniel." The room became very quiet after that. But children have a special kind of strength. Slowly, Daniel filled the house again with life. I would hear his footsteps running down the hallway in the morning. I would hear his laughter from the living room while he watched cartoons. Sometimes he would come into the kitchen and wrap his small arms around my waist while I was cooking. "Mom," he would say softly, "will you always be here?" And every time he asked that question, I gave the same answer: always. Our house was small and simple. The floors creaked in winter, and the paint on the walls was a little faded, but it held all our memories. The kitchen table had scratches from Daniel's homework projects and science experiments. The backyard had a crooked wooden swing that Daniel's father had built years before. Even after it started to lean a little to one side, Daniel refused to let me remove it. "Dad made it," he said once, holding the rope tightly. So I left it there. Years passed quietly. Children grow slowly when you see them every day. One moment they are small enough to sit on your lap, and the next moment they are taller than you. I worked hard during those years. During the day, I worked at a grocery store, and at night I cleaned offices downtown. It wasn't easy, but Daniel never complained. In fact, he often tried to make things easier for me. When he was 12, he started helping around the house without being asked. I would come home from work and find the dishes already washed. Sometimes there would be a small note on the kitchen table written in his careful handwriting. "Mom, I finished my homework," or "I made toast for you." Those little things meant more to me than he probably ever realized. Raising a child alone can feel like carrying something heavy for a long time, but Daniel always made that weight feel lighter. When Daniel became an adult, he kept many of those same habits. Even after he started working full-time, he visited me often. On Sundays, he would come for dinner and sit in the same chair at the table. We would talk about work, neighbors, and small everyday things. Sometimes we didn't even need to talk much at all. Just sitting in the same room felt comforting. Then one evening, when Daniel was 27, he came home later than usual. I was sitting in the living room with a cup of tea when I heard the front door open. He walked inside slowly, looking both excited and nervous at the same time. I knew that expression immediately because I had seen it before when he was younger and wanted to tell me something important. "Mom," he said, standing near the doorway, "I met someone." I smiled right away.
Mothers recognize that tone of voice. It carries a quiet happiness. "Her name is Sarah," he continued. That was the first time I heard her name. At first, she was only a name, mentioned during small conversations. Daniel would talk about her during dinner. "Sarah likes Italian food," he told me once while cutting his chicken. Another evening, he said, "Sarah works at a design company downtown." Sometimes he would mention small things that made him smile. "She has a cat that sleeps on her laptop while she works." I listened carefully to every detail because when your child loves someone, you want to know that person too. A few months later, Daniel asked if he could bring Sarah to dinner. I spent the entire afternoon cooking and cleaning the house. I made roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and Daniel's favorite apple pie. I wiped the kitchen counter so many times that it probably became cleaner than it had ever been before. When they finally arrived, Sarah stood quietly beside Daniel at the door. She had long, dark hair and calm eyes. "Hello, Mrs. Harris," she said politely. "Please call me Linda," I told her with a smile. During dinner, Daniel talked more than usual, telling small stories and jokes, while Sarah listened and smiled. She thanked me for the food several times. After we finished eating, she insisted on helping me wash the dishes. While we stood side by side at the sink, she said softly, "Daniel talks about you a lot." I laughed gently. "I hope only good things." She nodded. "Only good things." At that moment, I felt peaceful. I thought maybe this young woman would become part of our family in a natural and gentle way. About a year later, Daniel came home holding a small box. He didn't need to explain anything. His smile told me the answer before he even spoke. "I asked her," he said, "and she said yes." I hugged him tightly, feeling both proud and emotional. My little boy was starting a new chapter in his life. A week later, Sarah showed me the ring during dinner. It was simple but beautiful. She looked happy, and Daniel looked even happier. When they were leaving that night, Daniel hugged me near the front door and repeated the same words he had said months earlier. "Mom, nothing will change." I nodded again and smiled. But somewhere deep inside my heart, a quiet voice whispered something I tried not to hear. Life always changes. Sometimes slowly, sometimes so quietly that you do not notice it at first. And sometimes those small changes grow into something much bigger than anyone expected. The wedding was small and simple, just the way Daniel and Sarah wanted it. It took place on a warm afternoon in early spring at a quiet garden on the edge of town. The flowers were blooming and a gentle breeze moved through the trees as guests slowly filled the white chairs placed along the grass. I remember sitting in the second row, holding a small handkerchief and watching my son stand near the front beside the officiant. He looked nervous but happy. His suit felt a little too formal for him, yet his smile made him look confident. When Sarah walked down the path in her white dress, everyone turned to watch. Daniel's face softened in a way I had never seen before. In that moment, I realized how deeply he loved her, and my heart felt warm knowing that he had found someone who meant so much to him. During the ceremony, they held hands and promised to build a life together. Their voices were quiet but steady as they spoke their vows. I listened carefully to every word, feeling both joy and a small ache that I could not fully explain. It was not sadness exactly, it was more like the feeling you get when a chapter of a long story is slowly coming to an end. After the ceremony, people gathered around them with hugs and laughter. Music played softly, while guests shared food and stories. Daniel came over to me with Sarah beside him, and he wrapped his arms around my shoulders. "Mom," he said again, with that familiar smile, "nothing will change." Sarah nodded politely, and I smiled back, because I wanted that moment to remain happy. A few weeks after the wedding, Daniel and Sarah moved into a small apartment across town. It wasn't far, only about a 20-minute drive from my house, but the distance felt larger than that. On the day they moved, I helped carry boxes up the narrow staircase. The apartment was bright and modern,
with wide windows that looked out over the street. Sarah carefully arranged dishes in the kitchen cabinets, while Daniel moved furniture into place. I tried to stay out of the way, offering help where I could. At one point, Daniel placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "Mom, you don't have to worry about anything. We'll visit all the time." I nodded, telling him that I understood, and I truly believed that I did. The first few weeks felt normal enough. Daniel called every few days, just like before. Sometimes he would stop by after work for a short visit. We would sit at the kitchen table and talk about small, everyday things. But slowly, without any clear reason, the visits began to change. At first, it was only small things. One Sunday, he called to say they were busy and couldn't come for dinner. The next week, he said they had plans with Sarah's coworkers. I told him it was perfectly fine. "You have your own life now," I said. "Don't worry about me." And I meant those words. I never wanted to be the kind of mother who made her child feel guilty for growing up. Weeks turned into months. The house grew quieter again. Sometimes I would cook a meal out of habit before remembering that no one was coming. I would place the extra plate back in the cabinet and sit alone at the table. The silence was not painful at first, just unfamiliar. One evening, Daniel invited me to their apartment for dinner. I was happy to see them both and brought a small dessert with me. When I arrived, Sarah greeted me politely, but seemed a little distracted, moving quickly between the kitchen and the living room. Daniel looked tired from work, but gave me a warm hug. During dinner, we talked about normal things, but I noticed that Daniel checked his phone often while Sarah spoke about her projects at work. At one point, I asked Daniel if he would still come by on Sundays sometimes. He smiled and said, "Of course, Mom. Things have just been busy lately." Sarah didn't say anything, but she glanced at him briefly before continuing her story. That moment was small, almost too small to notice, yet something about it stayed in my mind during the drive home. As time passed, those little moments began to appear more often. Daniel still called, but the conversations became shorter. Sometimes his voice sounded rushed, as if he was speaking while doing something else. "I'll call you later, Mom," he would say, but later did not always come. One rainy afternoon, I decided to surprise them with homemade soup. It was Daniel's favorite kind, the same one he had loved since he was a boy. I drove to their apartment and climbed the stairs slowly, holding the warm container carefully. When Sarah opened the door, she looked slightly surprised to see me standing there. "Oh," she said politely, stepping aside. "Hello, Linda." Daniel was in the living room watching television. He stood up quickly and hugged me, thanking me for the soup. But Sarah looked at the clock on the wall and said they were about to leave for dinner with friends. I apologized for arriving without calling. "It's all right," she replied, though her voice carried a small tension that was difficult to describe. I left the soup on the kitchen counter and told them to enjoy their evening. On the drive home, the rain fell harder against the windshield. I told myself that it was normal for young couples to be busy. Still, a quiet feeling had begun to grow in my chest, the feeling that something invisible was slowly shifting. The following Sunday, I sat at the kitchen table with my tea, remembering how Daniel used to arrive around noon. The clock moved slowly across the wall. Noon passed, then 1 o'clock. By the time the afternoon light began to fade, I realized he was not coming that day. I did not feel angry. Instead, I felt something softer, something closer to quiet understanding. Life was changing for him, and I did not want to stand in the way of that. But as I washed the dishes that evening, the house felt larger than it had before, and the silence seemed deeper than it used to be. Months passed like that, with small changes that were easy to ignore but impossible not to feel. Daniel and Sarah were building their life together, and I told myself that this was natural. Yet sometimes late at night I would sit in the living room and look at old photographs on the shelf. There was one picture of Daniel at age 6 holding a wooden airplane toy. In the photo, he was smiling directly at me, full of trust and excitement. I would look at that picture and remember the sound of his small voice, asking a question he once asked many years ago. "Mom, will you always be here?" And as always, even in the quiet of an empty house, my answer remained the same. Always. As the months passed, the small changes in our lives slowly became part of a new routine. At first, I kept telling myself that everything was normal. Daniel was married now. He had responsibilities, work, and a new home to take care of. It was natural that he could not visit as often as before. I repeated this thought many times, almost like a quiet promise I made to myself. Still, there were moments when the silence in my house felt heavier than it used to. Sunday afternoons had once been full of noise and conversation. Now they often passed quietly, with only the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. One evening, Daniel called and invited me to dinner again at their apartment. His voice sounded warm, and for a moment I felt the same happiness I used to feel whenever he said he was coming home. When I arrived, Sarah greeted me with a polite smile and let me in. The apartment looked different from the last time I had visited. New decorations had been placed on the walls, and the living room furniture had been moved to another corner of the room. It was clear that Sarah had spent time making the place feel more like her own. During dinner, the conversation stayed light. Sarah talked about a project she was working on at her design company, and Daniel spoke about a new supervisor at his office. I listened and nodded, asking small questions whenever the conversation paused. At one point, I mentioned that the garden behind my house had started blooming early that year. "The roses your father planted are growing again," I told Daniel. He smiled politely but did not say much more. Sarah continued talking about work while Daniel quietly finished his meal. The moment passed quickly, but I felt a strange distance that I could not explain. Later that evening, while Daniel walked me to the door, I gently asked if he might come by the following Sunday. "We'll try," he said, though his voice sounded uncertain. When I drove home that night, I realized that his answers had slowly changed over time. They used to be certain and simple. Now they carried hesitation. Weeks passed again, and the visits became even less frequent. Sometimes Daniel would send a quick message saying he was busy with work or helping Sarah with something important. I always replied kindly, telling him not to worry and to take care of himself. But there were evenings when I would sit by the window with a cup of tea and watch the empty street outside, remembering how often he used to walk through that front door without warning. One afternoon, I decided to call Daniel just to hear his voice. The phone rang several times before he answered. "Hi, Mom," he said quickly, sounding distracted. I asked how he was doing and whether work was going well. "Everything's fine," he replied. In the background, I could hear Sarah speaking to him about something. Daniel paused for a moment before saying, "Mom, I'll call you back later, okay?" I said yes, of course. But that evening, the phone never rang again. A few days later, he sent a short message apologizing and saying he had forgotten. I told him it was all right. Yet something about that small moment stayed with me longer than I expected. It was not anger I felt, only a quiet understanding that the space between our lives was slowly growing wider. One rainy afternoon, I went through some old boxes in the hallway closet. Inside were school drawings, small toys, and notebooks from Daniel's childhood. I found a little blue notebook where he had written stories when he was about 10 years old. The handwriting was messy and full of imagination. One story was about a boy who built a spaceship in his backyard and promised to take his mother with him when he explored the stars. Reading those pages made me smile, but it also reminded me how quickly time passes. Later that evening, Daniel called unexpectedly. His voice sounded tired but calm. "Mom, Sarah and I might move to a bigger place soon," he said. "It's closer to our offices." I congratulated him and told him that it sounded like a good step forward. He explained that the new apartment would be in another part of the city, almost 40 minutes away. "It's not that far," he added quickly, as if trying to reassure me. I told him that distance was not important as long as he was happy, and I meant it. Every parent knows that children must build their own path in life. Still, after we ended the call, I sat quietly in the living room for a long time. The house felt even quieter than before. A few weeks later, they moved into the new apartment. Daniel invited me to visit once everything was settled. When I arrived, the building was taller and more modern than the one they had lived in before. The lobby was bright, with polished floors and large windows. Sarah met me downstairs and led me to the elevator. She spoke politely, but seemed a little reserved, as if she was thinking about many things at once. The apartment itself was beautiful. It had wide windows, a large kitchen, and a balcony overlooking the city. Daniel looked proud as he showed me around each room. "It's nice, isn't it?" he asked. I smiled and told him it was wonderful, and it truly was. But as we sat together in the living room afterward,
I noticed something that stayed quietly in my mind. The walls were decorated with many new photographs. Most of them were pictures of Daniel and Sarah together, with friends, co-workers, or members of Sarah's family. They looked happy in every photo. Yet there were no pictures of Daniel as a child, none of the old family photographs that used to sit on the shelves in our house. It was a small detail, one that most people might never notice. But when you are a mother, you see these things without trying. I did not say anything about it. Instead, I asked Sarah about the view from the balcony and complimented the way she had arranged the living room. She thanked me politely and offered tea. The conversation remained friendly and calm, but a quiet distance filled the spaces between our words. When I left that evening, Daniel walked me down to the entrance of the building. The street lights had already turned on, casting soft yellow light across the sidewalk. Before I got into my car, he hugged me and said, "Mom, we'll visit soon." I smiled and told him to drive safely whenever he traveled. As I drove home through the quiet streets, I realized something that I had been slowly learning for months. No one had said anything unkind. No arguments had happened. No doors had been slammed. And yet, without anyone planning it, the closeness that Daniel and I once shared was gently slipping further away, like a small boat drifting slowly from the shore. And the most difficult part was that I did not know how to stop it. The distance between us did not happen in one sudden moment. It came slowly, like a quiet winter that arrives one cold morning at a time. After Daniel and Sarah moved to their new apartment, our visits became even more rare. At first, Daniel still called every week or two. The conversations were kind but short. He would ask how I was doing, and I would tell him that everything was fine. Then he would say that work had been busy, or that he and Sarah were planning something for the weekend. I always listened carefully, happy just to hear his voice. But sometimes, after we ended the call, I would sit quietly with the phone still in my hand for a few seconds longer than necessary. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was more like a feeling of space that had quietly grown between us. One Sunday afternoon, I decided to bake apple pie, the same recipe Daniel had loved since he was a boy. I hadn't made it in a long time. As the smell filled the kitchen, memories returned without warning. I remembered Daniel sitting at the table, swinging his feet under the chair while waiting for the pie to cool. He would ask again and again, "Is it ready yet?" And I would laugh and tell him to wait a few more minutes. That afternoon, when the pie was finally finished, I realized there was no one to share it with. I placed a small slice on a plate and sat at the table alone. The house felt very still. A few weeks later, Daniel called with news. His voice sounded both excited and nervous. "Mom," he said, "Sarah and I are thinking about starting a family." For a moment, my heart felt lighter than it had in months. The thought of a grandchild brought a warm feeling I had not expected. I congratulated him and told him that he would be a wonderful father. He laughed softly and thanked me. But after that call, several more weeks passed without any news. When I finally spoke with Daniel again, he sounded tired. He explained that Sarah had been stressed at work and that they were trying to focus on their
careers for the time being. I told him that there was no rush. Life has its own timing, and everything happens when the moment is right. Not long after that conversation, something small happened that stayed with me longer than it should have. One afternoon, I went to the grocery store and ran into an old neighbor who had known Daniel since he was a child. She smiled warmly and asked how he was doing. I told her that he was well and living across town with his wife. Then she said something that surprised me. "Oh yes," she replied. "I saw him last weekend at the park with Sarah and her family. They looked very happy." I nodded and smiled politely, but inside I felt a quiet pause. Daniel had been nearby, only a few minutes from my house, and I hadn't known. That evening I thought about calling him, but I decided not to. I did not want to sound hurt or demanding. Instead, I reminded myself that he had the right to spend time with his wife's family. Still, a quiet question remained in my mind. When had our lives become so separate that I no longer knew when he was nearby? A few days later, Daniel called again. His voice sounded normal, cheerful even. He asked how I had been and whether the garden was still growing well. I told him that the roses had begun blooming again.
For a moment, I almost mentioned the park, but the words stayed in my throat. Instead, I asked if he and Sarah were doing well. "We're good," he said. "Just busy, like always." The conversation ended politely, like many of our recent calls. That night, after I washed the dishes and turned off the kitchen light, I walked through the quiet house and noticed how many small reminders of Daniel still remained. His old room had become a storage space over the years, but I had never fully changed it. The bookshelf still held some of his childhood stories and school trophies. His old baseball cap still hung on the hook behind the door. I stood there for a moment, looking around at the familiar objects. They felt like pieces of a time that now existed only in memory. Months passed again, and autumn slowly arrived. The trees outside my window changed from green to shades of gold and red. One evening, Daniel called with news that surprised me. "Mom," he said gently, "Sarah got a new job." I congratulated him, asking where she would be working. "It's a big opportunity," he explained, "but it might mean longer hours." I told him that opportunities like that should never be ignored. I could hear relief in his voice when I said those words. Before ending the call, he promised again that he would visit soon. But as the weeks continued, the visit did not happen. One quiet afternoon, as rain tapped softly against the windows, I sat in the living room looking through an old photo album. There was one picture of Daniel from his first day of school. His backpack looked too large for his small shoulders, but he was smiling proudly at the camera. I remembered how nervous he had been that morning. He had held my hand tightly before walking into the classroom. "You'll still be here when school ends, right?" he had asked. I had knelt down beside him and said the same words I had said many times during his childhood. Always. Sitting there with the album in my lap, I realized something quietly painful. Daniel had grown into a good man. He had built a life, found love, and created a home of his own. That was exactly what every parent hopes for. Yet, somewhere along the way, the simple closeness we once shared had slowly faded into something more distant. No one had planned it. No one had meant for it to happen. Life had simply carried us in different directions, the way rivers slowly separate after once flowing together. And although I understood that truth, there were still evenings when the silence in my house felt deeper than it used to, and I wondered if Daniel ever noticed the space that had quietly grown between us. Winter arrived quietly that year. The mornings became colder, and a thin layer of frost began to appear on the grass outside my window. I spent more time indoors, making tea and reading small books in the living room. Life had become peaceful in its own quiet way. I had slowly learned to live with the silence that filled the house. Sometimes Daniel called, sometimes he didn't, but I had stopped waiting beside the phone the way I used to. One evening, just before the holidays, Daniel called unexpectedly. His voice sounded gentle, almost hesitant. "Mom," he said, "Sarah and I are hosting a small dinner next weekend. Her parents will be there, and a few friends from work. We thought maybe you could come too." For a moment, I felt surprised. It had been a long time since I had been invited to anything like that. "Of course," I replied warmly. "I would love to come." The evening of the dinner arrived with cold wind and soft snow falling from the sky. I dressed carefully and brought a small homemade dessert, the same apple pie Daniel had always loved. When I arrived at their apartment building, the lights inside were bright and cheerful. I could hear voices and laughter even before Sarah opened the door. The apartment was full of people. Sarah's parents were sitting in the living room, speaking with a couple who seemed to be coworkers. Daniel stood near the kitchen counter, pouring drinks for everyone. When he saw me, he smiled and gave me a quick hug before returning to greet other guests. I placed the pie on the kitchen counter and joined the others in the living room. Everyone was polite and friendly, but I felt slightly out of place among the conversations about offices, projects, and travel plans. Most of the guests knew Sarah well, and their laughter filled the room easily. I listened quietly, smiling when someone spoke to me, but often the conversation moved on before I could add anything. During dinner, we all sat around a large table. Sarah had prepared many dishes, and the food looked beautiful. Her parents sat close to her while Daniel moved between conversations, trying to keep everyone comfortable. At one point, Sarah's mother asked Daniel about his childhood. Was he always such a calm person? She said with a laugh. Daniel smiled and shrugged. I guess so, he replied. For a moment, I almost told a story about how energetic he had been as a child, how he once tried to build a treehouse in the backyard using old boards and a hammer that was too big for his hands. But before I could speak, another guest began talking about a trip abroad, and the moment disappeared. After dinner, people moved back into the living room with cups of coffee. The windows showed soft snow falling outside under the streetlights. I sat quietly on the couch while others continued their conversations. From where I sat, I could see Daniel standing beside Sarah near the balcony door. They looked comfortable and happy among their friends. Watching them together, I felt both proud and strangely distant at the same time. Later that evening, I walked into the kitchen to collect my coat. Sarah was there alone for a moment, arranging empty plates near the sink. She smiled politely when she saw me. "Thank you for coming, Linda," she said. "The pie was very good." I told her that I was glad everyone enjoyed it. Then there was a small pause between us. Finally, she spoke again, her voice calm but careful. "I hope you don't mind that things are sometimes busy here," she said. "Daniel and I are trying to build our life together." I nodded slowly. "Of course," I replied. "That's exactly what you should be doing." She looked relieved when I said those words. Just then, Daniel entered the kitchen and asked if I was leaving already. I told him it was getting late and that I didn't want to keep them from their guests. He walked me to the door and hugged me briefly before returning to the living room. As I stepped outside, the cold winter air touched my face. Snowflakes drifted quietly through the light of the street lamps. I walked slowly to my car, holding my coat tightly around me. During a drive home, the roads were almost empty. The radio played soft music in the background, but my thoughts were quiet. For the first time in many months, I felt something shift inside my heart. It wasn't anger or sadness. It was a kind of understanding that had finally become clear. Daniel had not meant to change our relationship. He had not forgotten me out of cruelty. He had simply moved forward into a new life, the way all children eventually do. And in that life, I was no longer at the center the way I once had been. When I arrived home, I turned on the small lamp in the living room and sat down for a moment. The house felt just as quiet as it always did, but something inside me had grown calmer. I realized that love does not always stay in the same place. Sometimes it moves, reshapes itself, and finds a different space in our lives. That night, I looked at the old photograph on the shelf again, the one of Daniel holding his small toy airplane when he was 6 years old. In the picture, he was smiling at me with complete trust. I touched the frame gently and whispered the same words I had always said when he was young. "I'm still here." And in that quiet moment, I understood something important. Being a parent does not mean holding on forever. Sometimes it means learning how to stand quietly in the background, loving someone just as deeply, even when their life moves beyond your reach. After that winter evening, life became quieter, but also clearer in a way I had not expected. I stopped measuring time by Daniel's visits or phone calls. Instead, I began to focus on the small rhythms of my own days. In the mornings, I watered the plants near the kitchen window. In the afternoons, I worked in the garden when the weather allowed. The roses that Daniel's father planted years ago were still growing, and caring for them brought a quiet sense of comfort. Weeks passed, and the cold winter slowly softened into early spring. One afternoon, while I was trimming the rose bushes, my phone rang inside the house. I wiped my hands on a cloth and walked inside to answer it. It was Daniel. His voice sounded different from usual. Not rushed, not distracted, just quiet. "Hi, Mom," he said softly. I asked how he was doing, and there was a short pause before he replied. "I've been thinking about you a lot lately." Those words surprised me. Daniel was not someone who often spoke about his feelings directly. I asked if everything was all right.
Yes, he said slowly. Everything is fine. I just realized I haven't been around much. I smiled, even though he could not see me. You have your own life, I told him. That's how it should be. But Daniel did not respond immediately. After a moment, he said something that stayed with me long after the call ended. I don't think I understood how much things changed. That evening, he asked if he could visit the following weekend. When Saturday arrived, the sky was bright and warm, the kind of spring day that makes the whole world feel fresh again. Around noon, I heard a familiar knock at the front door. When I opened it, Daniel was standing there alone. For a moment, we simply looked at each other and smiled. It had been several months since I had seen him in my house. He stepped inside slowly, glancing around the living room as if he were noticing everything again for the first time. Nothing here has changed, he said quietly. I laughed softly. Some things don't need to change. We sat together at the kitchen table with cups of tea. The sunlight came through the same window where we had shared so many conversations over the years. For a while, we talked about ordinary things, his work, the weather, the garden outside. But eventually, conversation became quieter and more serious. Daniel looked down at his hands before speaking again. Mom, he said, I think I've been a little distant. I did not answer right away. Instead, I watched the steam rise slowly from my tea. Finally, I said, life gets busy. He shook his head gently. It's more than that, he replied. When Sarah and I got married, I thought I could keep everything exactly the same. I didn't realize how much attention a new life needs. His voice carried a mixture of regret and honesty. I could see that he had been thinking about these things for a long time. I never wanted you to feel forgotten, he added quietly. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. Daniel, I said softly, I know you never meant that. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside the window, a bird landed on the fence in the backyard, its wings moving gently in the warm air. Daniel looked around the kitchen again, noticing the same old cabinets, the same wooden table, the same quiet atmosphere he had known since childhood. I miss this place sometimes, he admitted. It always felt peaceful here. I smiled. It still is. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking more openly than we had in years. He told me about the pressures at work, about Sarah's long hours, about how quickly life had begun to move for them. I listened carefully without interrupting. When he finished, I simply said, growing up is not always easy, even for adults. He laughed quietly at that. Before leaving, Daniel walked through the hallway and paused near the door of his old room. He opened it slowly and looked inside. The room still held the same bookshelf and the same old baseball cap hanging on the wall. You kept everything, he said. Some memories deserve a place, I replied. He nodded, understanding more than I needed to explain.
The afternoon sun began to fade. Daniel prepared to leave. At the front door, he hugged me longer than usual. I'll come again soon, he said. I smiled and told him he was always welcome. When his car finally disappeared down the street, I stood by the window for a moment, watching the quiet neighborhood. Something inside me felt lighter than it had in a long time. The distance between us had not disappeared completely, but a small bridge had begun to form again. And sometimes, even a small bridge is enough to bring two people closer than they have been in years. The days after Daniel's visit felt lighter, though the quiet of the house remained familiar. I continued my small routines, watering the plants, tending the garden, reading in the living room. But now there was a sense of hope underneath the stillness. A week later, Daniel called again, his voice calm and warm. Mom, he said softly, Sarah and I were talking. We realized we haven't spent much time with you lately. Can we come over this weekend? I smiled without hesitation. Of course, I replied. When Saturday arrived, I prepared the house in a way I had not done for a long time. I dusted the shelves, arranged fresh flowers on the table, and even baked Daniel's favorite apple pie. The smell of it filled the kitchen, carrying with it memories of years past. By noon, there was a knock at the door.
Daniel and Sarah stood there, both smiling. Sarah's hand found mine briefly, a quiet gesture of warmth and understanding. "Hello, Linda," she said. "It's nice to be here." Daniel hugged me longer than usual, and I felt the tension of the past months slowly ease. Inside, the house felt alive again. We sat together at the table, sharing food and stories, talking about everything and nothing all at once. Daniel told me about his work, Sarah's new projects, and small funny moments from their life. I shared stories of the garden, the roses, and the small things that had happened while they were away. At one point, Daniel reached across the table and took my hand. "Mom," he said softly, "I'm sorry for being distant. I didn't realize how much things changed." I smiled gently, feeling tears rise but not fall. "It's okay, Daniel," I replied. "Life moves forward. That doesn't mean love disappears." He nodded, understanding more than words could express. For the rest of the afternoon, we lingered in the living room. Daniel and Sarah helped tidy up after tea, but mostly we just sat together, enjoying each other's company. The distance that had grown over months did not vanish completely, but it became smaller, filled with recognition, understanding, and quiet forgiveness. As the sun began to set, Daniel hugged me again at the door. "We'll come again soon, Mom," he said. I nodded. "You're always welcome." Later that night, after they had left, I walked through the house, touching the familiar surfaces: the kitchen counter, the wooden table, the bookshelf with old trophies and photo albums. Every corner held memories, both old and new, and now there were new ones being added. I realized that life changes, sometimes in ways we do not expect. Children grow, families shift, and people we love find their own paths. But love does not disappear. It reshapes itself. It finds new places to live in our hearts. Sitting quietly in the living room, I understood something important. Being a parent means learning to stand back sometimes, letting life carry our children forward, and trusting that the bond we share can endure distance, time, and change. I looked at the photograph of Daniel holding his toy airplane, smiling at me so many years ago. I whispered softly, "I'm still here, Daniel, always." And in that moment, I felt the quiet strength of love that survives everything, the kind that does not fade, even when life moves on. The house was calm, the garden waiting for spring, and I knew that whatever the future held, we would face it together, in our own way, with understanding, forgiveness, and the warmth that only a family can give.